right, welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kelly Atkinson, Director of Business Systems at Barnes & Thornburg and Chair of the CMC Board of Trustees. I'm so pleased that you're all with us today. So let's also take a moment to thank the beautiful Grange Insurance Audubon Center for its ongoing support. Thank you as well to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream. Let's thank all of those supporting today's forum. Now for today's forum. According to a study by the Pew Research Center, 78% of Ohioans identify with a particular religion. With today's panel, we will discuss the role of religion in shaping society in Central Ohio and the challenges faced by organized religion today. We will also examine the public misunderstandings of their faiths and what happens in a diverse democracy when religion and politics mix. Please welcome today's distinguished speakers. Victor Davis, pastor of Trinity Baptist Church, Earl K. Fernandes, Bishop of the Catholic Diocese of Columbus, Hillel Skolnik, Senior Rabbi of Tifereth, Israel, and Justin told me I could call him Justin so that I didn't botch his name or show any disrespect. So Justin Wood, Youth Director for the Noor Islamic Cultural Center, and our host, Jerry Revish, retired television news anchor with WBNS TV and pastor and co-founder of the Unity Temple Church of God in Christ. Jerry, we are very excited for today's conversation. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. This building is just so fabulous. It just brings the outdoors in, and the light is good. You know, I am not a big winter person. I just don't care for a lot of gray skies and cold weather, but at least it's bright today. So thank you for letting me vent about winter. We've got a great panel here today. There's a lot going on in the world, and they're touched by all of it because they deal with people every day who have a myriad of issues, challenges, and problems, and they themselves have to navigate all of that to get people to a healthy state in their lives. We're addressing community issues today. First off, I want to talk about COVID just a little bit. On May 11th, the president is going to declare the end of emergency declarations for COVID. Although we're still living with the residue of COVID, more than 1 million people have died from that pandemic in our country. But I'm going to ask you, gentlemen, to just take us back to 2020, when we got the notice from the government, from the governor, that we were going to shut down the state for a little while. He never shut down churches. He just limited the number of people that could meet at a church for a time. And then that ramped up to where we are today. But Dr. Davis, take me back to how COVID impacted your ministry, impacted your church. How did you handle that?
COVID tested our faith and our practice. If the other culture, the majority culture, gets a cold, we already have pneumonia. And so for many of us, it challenged us to do ministry in ways that we had not done before, i.e., social media, use of cell phones, texting, programming calls, and connecting. If your church was already not connected, it was very hard to connect. So you had to make sure connection went on. Not to mention the thought of raising funds. Everyone knows that if you're going to do ministry, you need funds. So it pushed us to be creative, and it tested our faith in these moments.
Thank you very much. Let me ask the same question to Father here today. How did you make the adjustment? What did you do when COVID struck and shut down everything?
Well, at the time, I was a pastor of a parish in Cincinnati, so 3,000 families, 1,160 children in the elementary school, so it was a huge place, and we started to live stream Mass because we couldn't have so many people in the church. We started to make use of the social media. I did a Facebook video every single day of the pandemic for more than a year to keep connected with the parish and parishioners because I'd only arrived there just a few months earlier. So even just to get to know them. We had the parish staff call every single person on our roster just to see how they were doing. So because already we perceived this danger of isolation. Then we had the children, because we had a big elementary school. How do you keep them engaged in school and learning, online learning? Many people would always say, oh, Father, if only I had more time with my family or more time to pray, then everything would be okay. And then they got it and they realized, I don't know how to be with my family. I don't really know how to pray. And so it was equipping them to learn how to be rather than to do, how to value people, how to make use of technology appropriately, but realize that there's a lot more to life than technology and than work. And so that was a great challenge. And then emerging from it was trying to reestablish the bonds of community and that sense of belonging rather than watching everything virtually.
Amazing thought there. I'm pulling out of that when you said, I don't know how to be with my family. I don't know how to be with my kids. And you know, we really had more time together with our families than we may have maybe ever had. And so we had to learn how to navigate all of that. And I think we're still learning how to do that in a lot of different ways. Rabbi Skolnik, what was your experience?
First of all, thank you so much for having all of us and for welcoming us here this afternoon. It turned out that they should have taught us in rabbinical school a master class on Zoom and how to navigate that opportunity for people to be together. In Jewish tradition, you need to have 10 Jewish adults in order to conduct a worship service in its most complete fashion. We transitioned immediately to saying instead of 10 people in person, we needed 10 people on Zoom. And as it turned out, people were eager to be together in any way that they could. And so our services just became Zoom services. I was grateful that I had a moment of forethought and brought a Torah scroll home with me at the very beginning of the pandemic. And it lived in my house for about a year and a half. And anytime we needed to read from the Torah, I read from the Torah at my dining room table. It was decidedly inconvenient for my children who wanted to eat breakfast, but it was also its own beautiful family moment for me because one of the rituals that we have is lifting the Torah and dressing the Torah. And when it was time for that part of the service, I would just shout, "Kids, let's go!" And they would scatter over. But I echo that challenge of in this time of still living with the remnants of it and people continuing to be sick and hopefully getting better, but people continuing to lose their lives around the world, it is still a challenge to bring people back together in person as well. There is something about the comfort of being in your own home and knowing that as long as you're dressed nicely on top, you can wear shorts and whatever shoes, hopefully, on the bottom. And then that challenge of coming out of the house and believing that we can be safe and healthy together again is one that we continue to engage with.
Thank you very much. As long as you didn't stand up. When you stood up, some people lost their jobs over that. Amazing time it was. Justin, tell me what it was like for the Noor Islamic Cultural Center when COVID shut down everything.
It was interesting because I was, at the time, the chairman of the board of the Noor Islamic Cultural Center. And in retrospect, it's silly, but as the pandemic first comes on, we're gathered in this tight room together to talk about whether we should close or not. And not knowing it, but we washed our hands, though, and we made sure they were sanitized, right? So we did eventually decide to shut down services entirely. And as the pandemic went on and guidance evolved, we eventually had a system where we would stand in prayer. And if you're familiar with the mosque, we don't have seating, right? It's an open floor plan. So we're standing in prayer, but standing 6 feet apart. So we had our volunteers tape off where 6 feet was exactly and did it that way. When Ramadan came around and many more people came to the mosque, we actually prayed outside. And so we had a parking lot, we got tents, and just really tried to make it as safe as possible while still allowing people to come together. Zoom was great in the beginning. We had a lot of people who liked the idea. And one of the good things about Zoom is that there are some folks in all of our communities, right, who aren't mobile. They can't come. And it really kind of helped us to see that blind spot. And those services benefited those folks who just can't get out of the house regardless, whether there's a pandemic or not. So that was a big blessing in terms of expanding our services. But we found as things have returned to normal, people have really rushed back because I think they appreciated that we took being together for granted. And when we had the opportunity to do it again, we found that our programming has become much more involved and engaged as people have those opportunities again.
Yeah, it gave birth to some new opportunities for all of us. When we had to think out of the box, so to speak, we had to do other things, the advent of Zoom and live streaming. Talk to me about live streaming, because some people didn't come back to church. They attend church on live stream. They see you and they know you that way. But how did it affect your attendance and the way you do church? Reverend Davis.
How you gonna pick me first?
Because you're the closest one. I'm gonna start the other in the next question.
Man, I just processed the question. How did we do Zoom? How did we do Zoom? How did we do church? It caused us to stretch our method of delivering the same message. We had people who had never been on Zoom, had never been on a conference call, didn't participate in Facebook and other social media outlets. All of a sudden, you've got my 80-year-old grandmother now talking about, put me on that book face. And even as we preached and as we taught, we had to speak to an audience that we did not see. We had to make them feel a part of our ongoing conversation. You know, you had to say, those of you out there in Facebook land, tweet this or post this. You know, in the African American church, we are a call and response community. We love you saying amen. That's like throwing red meat to a dog. And so, you know, you didn't hear that. We standing in the pulpit of an empty church and nobody saying amen, preach, pastor. So you had to say, people, post it. You know, post your amen. And then we got smart. You have your iPad, and as names rolled of people watching, you started to become personal with them because you started calling their names. It also pushed us to be creative. Sometimes, if we are honest, we get a little lazy. But we learn how to use PowerPoint, and we learn how to use other mechanisms that help us teach better and touch our communities better. Also help to save our voices, because you know we tune up in our church, but it felt so good to have bodies back in the congregation and people touching and the warmth that we shared.
Don't forsake the assembly.
That's what the book says.
Love yourselves. Bishop Fernandes.
So, again, we use live streaming for all our masses and services. In Catholic worship, there's a structure. You know, and some of the time you're addressing the people when you're preaching and reading the scriptures. Other times you're addressing God in the Eucharistic prayer. For us, to be in person and to receive Holy Communion, the Eucharist is very important. So to do things virtually, you know, people got dressed up in their Sunday best, so to speak, for the first few weeks. Some families even tried to stand up or kneel down or whatever. And then after about 3 weeks of that, you know, they're on their couch with a cup of coffee watching. And if you're boring, then they switch to a different church service.
Maybe even a synagogue.
Right.
Yeah.
But they wanted to be engaged. So again, in-person worship was always the goal for us. Mm-hmm. Yet we still had to nurture people by preaching and to give them a sense of what is it? We're still praying for all of you. We're still remembering all of you. We're still connected, and we're still lifting you up. And so that was very important. And someone before was saying, well, you know, really had the sense of what about those people who live in isolation? And I remember going to hospitals and nursing homes, and they wouldn't let me in the building, and being outside in the snow, saying Mass and having to hand off a pyx with Holy Communion to those on the inside to distribute to the elderly because they were so isolated. So you have the use of technology, yet the goal was always, let's get back together.
It also made us swallow our words because, you know, I remember the Sunday prior to, I said the state wasn't going to tell me what to do as a church. You know, the governor didn't have that right. I'm a person of faith. I'm a person of this. And within 7 days, I had to swallow those words because even though I am a person of faith, I believe God gifts people to give us understanding and clarity, and I didn't want to bury anybody as a result of my ignorance. So it tested us in that way, that it made your faith come alive in a different form.
Well, similarly, you know, two of my brothers are pulmonary critical care physicians, so I was hearing from them what they were seeing clinically. You know, they would even have to socially distance from their spouses. And I thought to myself, look, I claim to be a Catholic, I claim to be pro-life, how can I preserve human life and yet keep in balance diverse political groups, even within the community of faith, those who say, well, we shouldn't socially distance, we shouldn't submit to this overreach by the government, to those who are like, don't come anywhere near me, don't endanger my life. So there was always a kind of a tension to keep things in balance.
Rabbi Skolnik.
So we were actually live streaming our services before the beginning of the pandemic for those who were not physically able to join us. I will say I think live stream is a wonderful tool to make spiritual experiences accessible. And I'm so glad that we do it. My challenge with that is in our services, it sometimes ends up being that you're sort of bound by the camera location, and it makes it that much more challenging to do something different or do something creative without disrupting the experience of those who are watching virtually, which is an important constituency to care for and to guide them spiritually and to nurture their needs, but at the same time to balance that with creating an experience for those who are in the room is an interesting challenge. The other thing I would just say about Zoom, that while it was a wonderful gift to us, it also created a new way for those who we wouldn't want to be part of our spiritual experience to also join us. We had many experiences of Zoom intruders who would come into our Zoom room and start putting up pictures of all kinds of things and saying all kinds of awful things. And I will share the first few times that it happened, it was an awful shock to the system and really made people very nervous and concerned. By the time it happened for the 15th or 20th time, everybody had sort of figured out to just wait and be patient, and we had figured out, you mute everybody, you kick this one out of the room and that one out of the room, you wait 30 seconds, and then you can go on. But even in the times of the pandemic, it reminded us of that in all of our spiritual lives, there are those who look to support us, and there are those who look to do quite the opposite.
Thank you. Justin.
So we learned about Zoom passwords pretty early on.
Yeah.
For that very reason, right? Yes, we found that streaming services, we did do that. To the point that was made earlier, standing in an empty room, there's just a different energy. And you missed a lot of that, just even though in our services, we tend to have the congregants listening silently, but there's just a different vibe. Just look at us today, right? And shout out to all of you watching us on social media. We appreciate it, right? But there's a different vibe in the room, right? There's just something that in our human nature that we want to come together and congregate. For the services that we did in the mosque, there's actually an allowance, even for incidents back in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, when it would be raining, for example, heavily, the call to prayer that you may have heard 5 times a day, there's a call to prayer that's typically given. It would be altered, and the caller would say, pray at home, to let people know you don't need to endanger yourselves to come to the service because your health and well-being is paramount. And so this was a very extended pray in your homes kind of situation. And Zoom certainly was helpful. I think we still do some things with Zoom. It really did accelerate our acceptance of technology. But there's nothing like being together, and we really appreciate that we're able to do that again.
Thank you.
It also helped us adjust our services. We discovered there's a whole lot we were doing that we didn't need to do in the service, in the line of service. Now, I know that wasn't your case, but it took out a whole lot of stuff that just took up time, because we discovered that when somebody watches you via streaming, you've got a good 15 seconds to captivate them, or they're going somewhere else. And so you have conversation with your loved ones after church on Sunday. They said, well, how was church? They said, well, I went to the Catholic service, I went to the Jewish service, I went to the Muslim service, I went to all these services. You say, what did I get? I don't know what they preached about, but they all were good. And so
I definitely have some congregants congregants who wished I'd come to that conclusion.
Let's move on to another little topic that we want to move on to, politics and religion. They aren't as separate as they once were. Right now, the country is seeing a rise in what's called Christian nationalism, where some believe Christianity should be the guiding force in government. Can that idea coexist in a diverse and tolerant democracy where so many other religions are practiced? Rabbi?
I had an answer.
It's a tremendously important question. I lived in Orlando for 7 years before I lived here in Columbus, before I moved to my current congregation. And we had a much different split of people on different sides of the political aisle than is true of my congregation here in Columbus. And I became adept at the idea of making a point without having to say it specifically. To use the words of the 5 books of Moses, of the Torah, or a reading from the prophets for that day, to make a point about the people that we are and the morals by which we should live, which was applicable to something that was going on in our city or state or country or, in fact, the world, without having to hammer people over the head with the idea. What that did was allow me to preach about particular social issues and political issues, but offering a message that was true for everyone, even if some people took it to mean one thing and some people took it to mean what I wanted it to mean for myself. When it comes to any kind of religious values and how that works in our spiritual and political lives in our country, I will say personally, as a person of faith and as a proud citizen of our country and also as a Jewish person, I have no issue with people's spiritual and religious values informing the way that they make their decisions. In fact, informing the way that they hope to guide their families and themselves and sometimes their communities. The challenge that I find as a person who believes in the rights of a person to act the way that they want to and the separation of church and state is when those spiritual values become values that I have to take on because they are your values. I personally believe that our country was founded on the idea that we are all entitled to have our spiritual models and our religious ideas, and that they are able to be different from one another, and that itself is a protected right. Because then we can sit here together as a panel of 4 or 8 or 50 or 150 or more and continue to speak kindly with words of compassion and understanding. At the end of the day, I always understand religion to be something that guides us toward that idea. And if it can guide you toward that idea in the model of helping to lead your city, state, country, county, what have you, in a way that also protects my right to do so, then I support your religious ideas and your spiritual values, but not to the extent that they would infringe on my ability to express my own.
Thank you. Bishop Fernandes.
I would echo those sentiments. The Catholic Church has emphasized the dignity of conscience and religious liberty, especially in recent years. So we live in a pluralistic society. The United States is certainly one where there is a separation of church and state. Yet we understand the fundamental dignity of each person to express himself or herself, to embrace a particular religion or no religion whatsoever. Yet, at the same time, we also realize that religion and faith are not simply private matters either. They can be in the public square as proposals, never to be imposed, but to be proposed for the sake of the common good. And so religious values shape our citizens, and we want to form them in fundamental virtues. What becomes dangerous is when you use religion and faith for political ideology, whether on the right or on the left. The idea is that many times their politics comes before their actual faith, and they use elements of their faith tradition as proof text almost to make their political points. And then religion can be reduced to an ideology rather than an expression of the person or a worship of God. So again, my family is from India. So you have, Christians are a small minority, but you have majority Hindus, some Muslims, but you learn how to live in harmony by showing respect for the other person and the dignity of the other person and that person's conscience before God, where they hear the voice of God. So again, I would be all in favor of this kind of civil discourse and mutual respect and understanding, and in that way, religion can be a force for peace in our world.
Thank you.
The challenge is, now I'll talk,
Okay.
that there are political leaders or political parties in America that have accosted a faith movement to empower themselves. They have used, in this case, Christianity to push an agenda of the haves and the have-nots. When you look at America's history, America was founded primarily for religious freedom. Am I right?
Yes.
And all of a sudden, some 200 plus years later, now the political leaders are so religious. They're such people of faith. And what they've done, they've taken language of the faith and attached it to a political movement. And people of faith are running with it because they hear wolves in sheep clothing using those terms. That's the nice way of saying it.
Thank you, Reverend. Justin.
So I would echo the sentiments of my fellow panelists and also say that if you look around the world, there are political leaders of all faiths who engage in similar tactics. And it's our job as leaders of our religious community to find where that moderate stance is and where that balance is, and to expose when people are taking the name of religion or religious practice and abusing it. We have to be very cognizant of it. And we talk about, the question talked about a Christian nationalism. I know I can speak from the Islamic perspective. Even among Muslims, we can't agree about a lot of things regarding tenets of our, not the tenets, but how to execute certain parts of our faith. I know it's the same with Christians, the same with Jewish people, the same with Hindus. Anytime you have a faith that has nearly 1 billion people or hundreds of millions of people, you're going to have different interpretations. But it's our job to maintain this amazing experiment that allows us to have a forum like this. We take for granted that we can gather and have this sort of civil discussion. There are a lot of places in the world where this isn't possible, or where points that were made could lead to a problem once we go outside, right? It's a tremendous blessing that we're able to gather like this, and I appreciate everyone's hand in joining us today, and I know that that's work that we'll all strive to continue.
Thank you. Dr. King once called Sunday morning at 11 o'clock the most segregated hour in America. Most religions hold that all people were created equal by God, yet racism and prejudice remain across our nation. Why isn't the church, writ large, having more of an impact on this problem? Dr. Davis. I'll come back to you if you would prefer.
Well, first of all, let's say that if Dr. King was living today, because of COVID and what COVID has done to the church and to our faith community, I should say, we cannot say that 11 o'clock is the most racially divided time in America anymore. Most of us have one service, and then we watch it several times at whatever time it is. We also know that now there is an influx of diverse congregations that are growing rapidly as a result of intermarrying races, and even in cultures where these families are going to churches where they feel more comfortable because of their diversity in their faith, in their lives. What do I say? What is for me? It is not that the church has not. For me, we would not have the rights that we do have as African Americans if it were not for the church. The movement, when we say the movement, the civil rights movement of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, even the consciousness of America by dealing with the incensous attacks of policemen on young men's lives is raised by a preacher. For us, the preacher, the pulpit, the church, the faith community has always taken the forefront in educating and bringing to our knowledge of these are the things we ought to be fighting for. These are the things that everyone ought to have a right to. That all of us, if we just take care of the golden rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you, that the whole place will be better. But so for me, I can't say that the church has not. The church has always, let me say it again, has always been in the forefront of being the conscience of America and calling them to task.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to some specific questions for each of our panelists here, and hopefully we'll be able to get them all in. This one for Rabbi Skolnik. To what do you attribute the rise of anti-Semitism in America? How big of a problem is it across central Ohio? And what's been your advice to Jewish families on how to deal with it when their children are exposed to this kind of prejudice?
So for the record, that was 3 questions, so I'd like to pass at least one of them to Dr. Davis.
No, Rabbi, you got that one. You got it. Take it, Rabbi.
I think Central Ohio is emblematic of the entire United States, unfortunately, and in many ways reflective across the globe of the rise in acts of anti-Semitism. I alluded to before the fact that the pandemic gave an opportunity for those acts to rise even further through perpetrating Zoom intruders and things like that. Why is it happening? I think it's a very complicated question that we could spend a long session on with just me talking, and I don't want to do that. I get to talk enough in my synagogue as it is. But I think it has to do with fear that is used as a language in this country in particular to motivate people, to make them instead of being introspective and considering ways that they can change themselves, to say, here's a person who's to blame for your problems, and to use that as a tactic, whether it's spiritual or political or psychological or what have you, but to use that as a way of saying, cast your problems over there and let's unite around dislike for someone else, as opposed to uniting around common ideas like caring for the stranger or being kind to one another, or acts of charity and loving kindness, which could help us as a community. I don't think that the Jewish community is unique in its position as a place that people go to express that fear and that hatred. There are horrific acts perpetrated of all people of faith, including, though, very much so the Jewish community. What I say to members of our congregation who notice that we have to have police officers and armed security guards is that I wish it weren't the case. I wish we could continue to have those people be employed, because I don't want to take away their livelihood, but I wish that we could use the money that we have to spend on security to spend on outreach and to spend on programs and to spend on dialogue with people who may not look like us or think like us, but are humans as well. And I wish that we could do that, but I also want us to continue to be alive and to continue to be able to preach that message. I tell them that we take safety and security at the synagogue very seriously, and I hope to God that one day the day will come when we can take it seriously, but it can be expressed in a different fashion.
And I would add to that, we as Catholics consider the Jewish people to be our elder brothers in the faith, but I think one of the things that happens is we forget. When I was a child, my father had us watch a documentary called The Memory of the Camps. And we can never forget. And I think our educational system really needs to raise an awareness of what actually happened in the 20th century so that it never happens again, that the dignity of each and every person is always remembered. My brother is a physician, but also an ethicist, and so he teaches a course on medicine and the Holocaust. And so we need to help people never to forget. And at the same time, as leaders of the faith community, we cannot allow our religion to be co-opted by fundamentalism that seeks to destroy others. It says in the Christian scriptures, perfect love casts out all fear. Unless you meet someone, unless you encounter them fundamentally, you can't really get to know them. But once you meet somebody, then you can begin to say, this person, I have more in common with them in my humanity, and I can begin to love them as a brother or as a sister.
Thank you so much. We're going to be moving to questions from our live stream and in-person audiences in just a few minutes. If you have a question, we want you to step to the mic there, and we are going to take that. But as we get ready to, and if you're watching online, please type your question into the chat box before we take on the audience questions. I have one final question for our panel today. A growing number of people, especially young people, have stopped having any affiliation with organized religion. What's causing this alienation, and what will it take to win them back? Justin?
So as the youth director of the Noor Islamic Cultural Center, this is really one of our primary missions, is to determine what the cause is. And what we found is a few things. One is that in families where the child is empowered, is engaged on an intellectual level, is able to express questions and ask why, and to be curious about their faith, we tend to see those children develop autonomy and an attachment to their faith. And we do have some families who, for lack of a better term, just really force certain things on their kids. And we find that that's not sustainable. And so for us, it's really, a lot of our work is around educating parents on how to navigate the landscape. Now, for Muslims, it's a bit unique because we're already a minority, within a minority oftentimes. So we have a lot of people in our congregation who are immigrants, first generation, second generation, third generation, from different parts of the world. And it can be tough because, for example, our young people from Sudan and Somalia and these places, where they're catching a lot of the nonsense that we as African Americans have had to deal with for a long time, but then they have this added burden of having a funny name and speaking a different language, eating different foods. And then you put all that together, and then you have a different religion now, and it can really become something where to build confidence in a young person like that can be tough. It can be challenging. But at the same time, what I've found is that the alternative, the mindless scrolling on social media, again, shout out to our audience, not you, but other people, this isn't mindless, right? But the mindless scrolling on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and a lot of the things that we've seen the studies, right? The increase in depression among our young women because of their exposure to these unrealistic images and body images. Young men being exposed to unrealistic ideals of what certain things are. And all of those things, you find that many young people are starting to wake up and say, this is not fulfilling. And they often will then come to us and say, hey, I've tried this and this isn't working. What do you have to offer? And then it's upon us to come up with an answer that is in harmony with the modern challenges that they face.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for 30-second reactions because we're running out of time and we want to get the audience. But since you're eager to speak, go right ahead. You got your 30 here.
I was going to say, I think the challenge across faith movements is options. Our children have so many options. When I came along, which was just a short time ago, everything centered around my faith community. The Scouts, the Entre Nous Club, which was a club that taught you how to speak in public. Everyone went to church, and the whole community, everyone, the school calendar respected the faith community. You didn't have practices on Sunday. And so options, I think the more we have acquired as Americans, the further we've gotten away from our faith because of the options that we have.
Thank you so much. Father?
But I would also say that we haven't always presented the faith in an attractive way that draws them.
Yes.
That there are these other voices. Why is our voice less important? That is, we have to teach, we have to delight, we have to persuade, we have to expose young people because they have these deep longings of the heart for truth, goodness, and beauty, to belong to an actual community. This other stuff isn't working. So what is it that we offer? Do we offer a proposal that will resonate with their desires for truth, goodness, and beauty? And sometimes a risk is involved because they might say, well, this tradition in which I was raised doesn't resonate. But other times they'll say, yes, it does. In fact, I've tested it. I've seen authentic witnesses. Young people are tired of hypocrisy. Therefore, since it does resonate, I will follow and be a more authentic follower. And so what's involved, though, is the risk of freedom to believe and to say, yes, in fact, I do believe, I will follow, and this way of life actually brings me joy.
Thank you. Rabbi?
You know, I think that the answer hasn't entirely been found yet, right? I've heard this question asked a lot, both of me and of fellow spiritual leaders, and I think to myself, if someone had the perfect answer, then they'd be some sort of billionaire, and they'd be out on a book tour. And maybe there are people like that, and I should buy the book. But I also think that it's okay to recognize that, at least to my estimation, seemingly in every generation, parents look at their children, or church elders look at the next generation, or synagogue board members, or whoever it is that are the leaders of your house of worship look at the next generation and say, I don't know if I entirely understand you, or how you communicate with each other, or the things that you care about are different than the things that I care about, and the music that you listen to is different than the music that I listen to, and how do we get together in one house of worship all at the same time? It's not a new challenge, and yet it requires patience and I think a lot of elements of faith, that these things have ebbs and flows. And it's not that we can sit on our laurels and just wait around for people to come back, because I think they'll be gone forever, but also to recognize that, as was just said, a little bit of freedom and a little bit of faith goes a long way.
Thank you all. Lenny Cuthbert with CMC is curating questions from today's live stream audience. For those of you in person, please join her at the mic. And out of respect to others, please keep your questions brief. Lanny, what you get online?
Diane Peters from Surrendered Music, LLC asks, how can we care about each other? Sometimes it seems to me as if something happens to someone in one faith and the other faiths tend not to care as long as it doesn't affect them. Unless, of course, it's something really big, like the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and then everybody joins in because multiple faiths are affected. Why does this support go away until the next big horrible thing?
We're selfish. No big answer. We're selfish people. We are human. We are flawed. We are cracked. We are earthen vessels with flaws. And one thing that is common throughout all faith walks is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if we would live that out, we would have one of the greatest cultures and environments that we would ever live in.
Yet we also do see pockets of generosity. Like I spent a lot of my life with Mother Teresa's sisters, right? And they are sometimes in countries like Yemen or even in India where Christians are a small minority, yet they go out to the poorest of the poor and they serve them. Again, it's about remembering that this is my brother or sister who is in need, and it's about not being selfish. Love does not seek its own interest. It seeks the good of the other. And so I think that's what we have to constantly recall to our minds, the call to love.
First of all, hi, Diane, who's a member of my congregation.
You paid her, didn't you? You paid her. You paid her to ask a question.
I paid her to ask you a question. There's a Jewish teaching, Diane, of, I'll say it in Hebrew first, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor velo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena, which means it's not your responsibility to complete the work, but neither are you free to just say, nope, I'm not getting involved in it. And I think that we have in many ways forgotten that principle because of the fact that there are so many things out there that need our attention. We would forget to eat, which sometimes we do. We would forget to exercise, which I do all the time. But it's not our job as an individual to complete the work, but neither are we free to just ignore it.
Justin,
I would
go
quickly
ahead.
add that my experience, one of the most memorable experiences I had in our mosque was after the mosque attack in New Zealand, in which several people were killed. And a church group, the kids got together and wrote notes saying, "We love you, you're our neighbor, we're here for you," and just this huge card with all these kids' notes and drawings and things like that. We had it displayed in the mosque for a long time, and that's more of what I see, thankfully. I know we tend to think that we're at each other all the time, but more often than not, yes, we get the hate and things like that, but overwhelmingly, at least here in Central Ohio, I found our partners and our neighbors to be very supportive in those cases. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you. Sir, your question, identify yourself.
I'm Bill Wayhoff of Steptoe and Johnson PLC, and thank you so much for everybody being here. We were in a Central American country over the holidays in which the auxiliary bishop of the diocese had been jailed for speaking out against the way the government was treating its citizens. And at Mass on Christmas Eve, the priest had the courage to make reference to the bishop and ask us to pray for him. And the government regularly sends people in to record services, and then they take action based upon political statements. My question is, what can we, as faith communities, and even what should our country be doing to promote religious liberty throughout the world? Thank you.
Who wants to tackle that question?
I mean, I'll go first because, in fact, when I was in Rome, I was with another auxiliary bishop from the same diocese who was wondering, will I even be able to go back home? And so the Catholic Church speaks out regularly in favor of religious liberty, but this type of oppression is not new to us. The experiences of the last century also taught us a lot with the Iron Curtain and how many people were persecuted. Yet it raised an awareness. I grew up in Toledo, so we had Poles, Hungarians, and Slovaks who suffered, and then we knew people whose relatives were suffering. But we also realized, and Pope John Paul II helped us to understand the virtue of solidarity, to recognize we're in solidarity with those who suffer, to work with political leaders to try to get some things done to gain greater freedom, to not let people forget again about their responsibility toward their brothers and sisters, so that politically, from the pulpit, all of these things can come together to promote the common good, because it's of our basic nature to want to be able to worship God in spirit and in truth. And so to deny a person that right is truly an attack on the person himself and is an attack on all of us. And so I think we need to constantly persist in reawakening the consciences of our political leaders as well as our community leaders.
Thank you. Sir, your question.
My name is Brian Urbanski, and my wife and I are affordable housing providers supporting vulnerable populations here in Central Ohio, especially members of the justice-involved community. And housing insecurity and homelessness impacts followers of all faiths and all religions. And I'd like to hear about any programs or initiatives your churches and temples have implemented to address the housing challenges of your congregations, especially since the advent of COVID.
Very good. Who wants to go first? Rabbi.
I can jump on that. Sure. So thank you for the question. From the Islamic perspective, one of the pillars of our faith is called zakat, and it is an obligatory 2.5% of our wealth that we donate once we reach a certain threshold of savings. And that money is something that's given for those sorts of issues when you have someone that is poor, that is in need. And housing is a great part of that. And so we have everything from certainly rent assistance programs to help people who are in short-term need. And then on the long-term scale, skill building, IT programs, job services, things like that. We have an organization called Muslim Family Services. I know my panel here has similar organizations that we've partnered with them to direct folks who are in need in that regard. It's certainly on our radar. It's certainly something that we work at, but there's the need vastly outstrips our resources as a community, but thankfully we have a lot of partners that we're working with in that direction.
Presently, the congregation of Trinity Baptist Church is in partnership with National Church Residences. National Church Residences is the largest provider of senior housing in America. And in our effort to provide housing in our community, we're partnering with them to build a senior housing community. Many of our faith denominations have land. They have land that's dormant. And so I would encourage them to partner with agencies and organizations that they can provide housing for seniors or multi-income housing, develop programs of partnership with agencies where we can help people not only live below income or at income, but also become homeowners. And so that's what our congregation is doing.
Well, and Monsignor Joe Hendricks is here in the middle of the room, and he's helped establish a Seton Housing Project throughout our 23 counties to make affordable housing available, not just to Catholics, but to all kinds of people. And so that's one effort. The Catholic Social Services helps people, St. Vincent de Paul Society. And again, long-term, it's about job training and stabilization. One of the long-term impacts of the pandemic is you lose your job, you lose your house. It creates the conditions of instability, which then harms the family, harms the individual. And so we're still recovering from the pandemic, but there are many things that the Catholic Church in North Central Ohio does to help address homelessness.
The only thing that I would add is our synagogue was one of the founding members of the Bread organization here in Central Ohio, which does a lot of important work in this particular area, trying to work on a communal level, city and county-wide, to build more affordable housing, particularly for those who are earning only $30,000 a year, which if you work a $15 an hour job, that's the threshold that you reach. And there is an unbelievable lack of affordable housing in that area. That is a good place and a wonderful organization to reach out to, and happy to talk to you afterwards as well.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question.
Good afternoon. My name is Stan Cartwright, and I serve as a deacon with the Trinity Baptist Church here in Columbus. You might have heard from my pastor today. But with the advent of COVID, I know each and every one of us was touched in a special way, and that has to do when we had to deal with the homecoming or homegoing. How did you and your churches and individual religions deal with any type of changes that you might have had to have made as a result of that?
Good question. Let's go to his pastor.
State your question again. How do we deal with funerals?
Yeah.
How do we deal with funerals? This way, I personally witnessed my pastor agonize at each service. Okay, and normally a funeral service is something such that, you go through a personal situation with each and every one. As a pastor, you love your congregants and their families. So I'm just wondering, was there any special thing that you had to do to prepare yourself to change the way that you did in your churches?
I serve a congregation that's 99 years old, and the congregation has several generations in it. Change is hard, even if it's forced. One of the persons that's amen me right now lost a loved one, and we almost had to fight over the registration book. And that, if you don't know what the registration book is, that's the little book that everybody signs when you come in, because we were trying to be safe. The objective of a homegoing service is to celebrate the life and legacy of the one that is deceased. And it is to bring comfort to the family to live out that life and legacy once they're gone. The struggle that the pastor has, in my opinion, is the fight of tradition. the way it's always been done. And you're dealing with the loss of the loved one and then helping to help the family get to the other side. It's a case-to-case response. Every situation is different.
Thank you so much. We're just out of time. We could spend several more hours here today, but we can't. Thank you so much. Kelly Atkinson is now going to come for concluding remarks.
All right, I hope that you all enjoyed today's forum. I know that the Metropolitan Club has come together for almost 50 years already with this type of civic conversation. Like in civil conversation, it's so wonderful to see this happen on a religious bent, because I don't think that I've seen that before, and because Jesus is near and dear to my heart, I feel like this is needed to be talked about all the time. Like, I love this. So this one really quick round of applause for our panelists before I just say anything. And we also want to thank the Grange Insurance Audubon Center for its support for today's forum, our virtual seat patrons as well, and to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. And very special appreciation to today's speakers, Victor Davis, Earl Fernandes, Hillel Skolnik, Abdurrahman Justin Wood, and our host, Jerry Revish. And I also just want to say to you all, like, take your forum flyers home, like, make sure that you just, like, note all the people that you met today and connect with them later, because we all know that we should continue the conversation even past this room, and make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum here at the Grange Insurance Audubon Center. We will take to the stars for a forum with the new Star Labs space station planned for Ohio State with our host, the one and only Dr. Frederick Bertley from COSI. Lastly, thank you to each of you. We couldn't do this without you, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.